Before we get into the actual space issue, talk about the issue of migration. I mean, what are the figures looking like?
Well, absolutely. Thankfully in the city of Joburg, while we have a very large population, we also have a migrating workforce, which effectively means that if our fatality rate doesn't necessarily equate to our burial rate. So for us, it's largely important to accommodate in a very dignified way a request for primary burials. However, we are driving, due to the increase in demand, we are driving our communities to start considering alternatives.
You say that the mortality rate doesn't necessarily link into the burial rate. How does that work? Surely someone who dies wants to be buried.
Absolutely. I think we have a large migrating workforce, which means if you come from the homelands, you come from KwaZulu-Natal, you will opt, of course, to be buried in that particular province. So again, Joburg faces between 1,200 and 1,500 burials every month, which effectively means that we need to make sure there's adequate burial space. So we want to allay those concerns. We're saying, yes, there is adequate burial space in the city of Joburg. However, we need to change that narrative in terms of our dependency for new burials or new burial grounds. And for us, we'd like to say there's the option, of course, of cremations. And we know that there's some stigma for some communities in terms of that. So therefore, we are driving the second, the third, and where possible, the fourth burial in the same grave. And that's what we want to encourage our communities to start considering a more affordable option, a more dignified option. And having said that, certainly a place where you can visit a loved one, conduct your rituals, your prayers and so on at a particular site for the whole family.
So you're saying, sorry, to bury more than one person in one grave?
Absolutely.
How does that actually sort of logistically work? I mean, I guess at different depths.
Yes, quite right. We're now preparing that gravesite for 3 meters down, which can accommodate, or 4 meters, can accommodate 3 burials. We previously hadn't been preparing that gravesite that deep. But having said that, there's definitely an increase in the number of people considering that. We are engaging with religious organizations. We're talking to the funeral directors. But again, that conversation must happen with the families to say, if my granny is buried in a particular grave, there's no reason why I can't be buried in the same grave. And this is, of course, to take away the burden from future generations. We know that they're going to be bearing the burden of maintaining these dormant cemeteries. Currently, Johannesburg City has 38 cemeteries, of which 34 have reached full capacity for primary burials. So we're saying with our 4 cemeteries that still have burial space, we know that West Park here has between 5 and 7 years. You've got Diepsloot, you've got the Waterfall Cemetery in Midrand, and of course you've got the brand new Olifantsvlei Cemetery in the south of Joburg. And the reason why that's a brand new cemetery is because Avalon Cemetery, which was our busiest cemetery in the country, if not in sub-Saharan Africa, reached full capacity. So there's no more burial space in Avalon. And again, we don't want our future generations to bear this burden of maintaining these cemeteries. It is yours and my moral responsibility to start encouraging residents to start considering these alternatives. There's just no reason why we can't be burying in the same grave, especially if we have a loved one in that particular grave.
I guess also the difficulty, you spoke of the religious aspect to it, dealing with them. What have some of the kickbacks been? I know there's a kickback on cremation and possibly, you need to get your head around being buried in the same grave as whether it be a family member or not.
Quite right. We had some of the public engagements, and it was one of our taxi rank engagements, and she said, there's no way I'm going to go in with my sister. We're already fighting here, so I don't want to be buried in the same grave. And I think that's the sort of conversation we need to say, where possible, with your loved ones, with your siblings that have passed on, certainly consider the second burial option. We do know that some cultures are more receptive to cremations, even though we're seeing an increase in cremations across all cultural beliefs. But again, we're saying, please revert if cremations is an issue, if there's some religious stigma attached to that, please consider the second and third burial options. We also have two other options, which is a reduction burial in the same grave. So if grandpa's passed on a few decades ago, there's no reason why you can't reduce the remains found in that particular grave and then have somebody else coming after in the family to be buried in the same grave. And then the fourth option is mausoleums. Now, mausoleums are above ground structures, which are actually chambers, so a catacomb, if you want to call it, where you can bury three families in above ground, and then of course it's a wall. And many people opt for that also. It's the same cost as a brand new burial ground. So again, where our cemeteries, where there's adequate space, where we're finding that cemeteries no longer, due to the rocky area and so on, we are finding we can use the ground above that. And this is where we're considering mausoleums. So an interesting increase in the number of mausoleums as well. But our big drive at Joburg City Parks and Zoo is we appealing to those communities, we appealing to those champions, to people, high-profile personalities and so on. Please put your hands up. Let's hear from you. We want you to say cremations is an option. We want to hear you say second burial and third burial options is something that we should start considering to take away that burden from future generations.
In closing, are you obviously concerned about the space. Are there no opportunities where you've got other properties that you could maybe begin, other grave sites?
You know, the thing about
fill up with space. Yeah.
Burial space must be of the same quality as land for housing. And so we've got this push and pull in the city. There's this demand for new housing spaces, and of course there's this demand for burial grounds for our deceased, our beloved. And so we're having to balance that need. We're saying, yes, there is adequate burial space for the next 50 to 70 years. However, we need to start looking at those alternatives now to take away that burden. And I know I keep saying it, but it's our moral responsibility to do that.
Fantastic. Jenny, thank you so much for coming in to chat to us. Jenny Moodley from Joburg City Parks and Zoo. And I guess it's a fairly macabre way to talk about things, but it really is a genuine concern in the city going forward.